Hey, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest on our show. Today's guest, Rohit Kumar, is someone whose work has always inspired me. A little bit about Rohit before we jump into this conversation. Rohit is the CEO at Apnishala Foundation, transitioning from being a software engineer with Tata Consultancy Services. Rohit holds a double master's in education and software systems. However, he believes his most important learning came from working with students and teachers at the Akanksha Foundation, the American School of Bombay, and the Apnishala Foundation. He is an educator with 18 plus years of experience in various learning environments. Currently, he leads strategy, SEL design, and organizational development and advancement at Apnishala. Rohit also consults with the SEED project, co-facilitating diversity workshops for educators and organizations in the city. Rohit has also published on themes of SEL, mental health, well-being, for forums like Teacher Plus and other organizations in the field. So, Rohit, thank you so much for making time for this. I've always been a fan of your work at Apnishala. I actually spent the morning, watching the videos, you put out on your website. The first question I wanted to ask you, Rohit, and I know your journey has been so interesting from, computers to education to the classroom to Apnishala, but I want to go back to the roots, Rohit. What was Rohit like as a student growing up? I know you were born and brought up in Nainital, but you tell me your story from your own words.
Thanks, Abhishek, for this invitation. I think it has been lovely knowing you from many, many, many years. I think 15 years plus, right?
Yeah.
When you had come to one of my classrooms at Akanksha. Abhishek, actually was born and raised in a super tiny town on the eastern UP called Balia. It's a super, super chotu sa town. And I lived in a joint family. So I lived in a house with around 26, 28 people living together on a daily basis, right? So uh, in my mind, that's what how life is, just living with people and figuring it out on a daily basis. There were jhagdas in the house. There were also amazing days of uh, love and care, not just from my parents but also from my chachas and chachis and my cousins. Whenever I would if someone would ask me कि तुम्हारे कितने भाई बहन हैं, I would say हम लोग 6 भाई और 8 बहन हैं. That's how I was raised. And then I went to a boarding school, an army boarding school in Nainital, called Sainik School, Ghodakhal. And again, a lovely, lovely school. Had really good set of teachers who cared for me, and people who really believed in all young people's potential. And the school had, if you want to do sports, there were sports, and if you want to do cultural activities, there were them. And then again, great teachers who were like taking care of academic learning and growth, right? However, through all of this, and I'm just want to name that I was raised as a यूपी में सबसे छोटा बच्चा बेटा है. So in a patriarchal kind of society where तभी सब language नहीं थी, but you could see that I was always given more bhav in the house than my sisters. So I was kind of very used to kind of that kind of growing environment, and was born and raised in a Hindu Savarna family. So that comes with its own set of privileges. But those were defaults for me then, right? And you only grow up and start seeing the life differently and start interacting with the world, and then realize, okay, ये भी चल रहा है दुनिया में. So मेरे लिए the only thing that was different was that I was from a very young age, and I don't even know how young I was, that my attraction was always towards boys. And that was something that I would not understand, and I never questioned in my head. It just felt like, if you watch Bollywood cinema, I always think of myself with Shah Rukh, not with Kajol, right? Kind of situation. But it was always in my head, and I knew that that's something that you don't talk about. And it's not knowing in the mind, it's knowing in the body. You just don't talk about it ever. because you just don't, right? And then you went to a boys boarding school, and then boys boarding school, while it's all awesomeness, also brings its own stuff, right? The bullying that happens, the kind of harassment that happens with other boys, and again, in the garb of boys being boys kind of situation, right? You experience all of that, but also at the same time, I had like really caring adults. I had some really amazing friends who I could reach out to for love and support and joy. So uh, when I look back at it, it was an experience which was really full in its own way. I always dreamt of running a school, but it was like I don't know how to say this. It was just like a daydreaming kind of scenario. Like I would think of my home, acha is ghar, because it was a giant home, right? It was dada ka ghar types, and it has like 3 floors building and like many rooms and stuff. Like एक दिन जब मैं बड़ा होऊंगा और इस दुनिया में नहीं रहेंगे, मैं इस घर को स्कूल बना दूंगा, right? And it had a school kind of setting, right? It had like a angan which could have been converted into a basketball court and stuff like that. So I would imagine that, and especially when you are growing up in 80s 90s, you're watching kuch kuch hota hai and stuff, and you're seeing Shah Rukh Khan in a certain school and college, right? But very clearly, my dad in grade 10, my dad said that आपको तो I said मुझे continue नहीं करना है school में, because it was mandatory to study science, because that was what was offered in the school. And I didn't want to study science after then. I was like, I wanted to kind of, get into something else. So my dad asked, what else? Like, ladke aur kya padhenge? Like, what do you want to be? And I had no answer to what do I want to be. I only knew that I wanted to study, or the only answer I wanted to study languages more. And then Papa ne pucha, kya banoge usko padh ke? Teacher banna hai. And that was like, it was a kind of irony that we respected our teachers a lot, but we were not encouraged to become teachers, right? In families. And clearly that was because of the socio-economic conditions of teachers, which has been really underdeveloped as a profession in this country. So तभी समझ में नहीं आता था. I was like, कभी क्या बोलूं, मुझे टीचर तो नहीं बनना है. I knew that teacher नहीं बनना है. I was not able to articulate कि मुझे स्कूल खोलना है, because that was not a dream. Like, बच्चों का ड्रीम क्या होता है ना, एक दिन मुझे बस कंडक्टर भी बनना था, देन अगले दिन मुझे बुक शॉप खोलनी है, देन तीसरे हफ्ते मुझे स्कूल चलाना है. It was that kind of thing. So पापा ने बोला कि आर्ट्स तो लड़कियां पढ़ती हैं, साइंस पढ़ लो, फिर आगे देखते हैं. So I continued in that school, and I think it just stayed like, then after you finish your 10th, or then you do your 12th, and then after that I tried to get into NDA, because that was a requirement from that school. So everyone has to kind of try to appear for National Defense Academy if you are in a Sainik school. So I went through that, and तीनों attempt try करा, नहीं हुआ, of course. Thank God नहीं हुआ. I mean, no disrespect to the profession. I think I would not have been a good fit there. But that was a time that was also IT was coming up, and I wasn't very good with physics and chemistry. So it was funny that I was good with biology, I was good with math. But ये दो combination साथ में कहीं नहीं आते, right? You don't become anything with these combinations. So my dad said, computers कर लो, नया है तो कुछ हो जाएगा, right? So that's how I randomly tried and went for a bachelor's in computer applications. I gave my exam for BIT Mestra, and I got through. And I think that was a turning point for me. I think in the sense that I thought this could be my restart. And that was also the time I started kind of thinking about myself in a more serious way, in the sense that बचपन में आप सब कुछ, life was okay, right? खाना मिल रहा है, कपड़े मिल रहे हैं. बहुत बार जो घर की problems होती हैं, you are shielded from that, right? And I was youngest, right? I had so many cousins, but also I had 3 sisters and a brother. So I was always like this baby in the house who was taken care of. So, but then after, when I got into graduation, I think I started thinking of myself, अच्छा, शायद मैं boys school में था, इसलिए मुझे ऐसा लगता था, right? That I was attracted towards boys. I need to kind of restart stuff. I got more serious about it, studies. I was a very average kind of student in my school life. Like I almost passed in physics in grade 12. Like my theory score was lesser than my lab scores. It was that bad. So I had to kind of restart, and computers were like I enjoyed them. So it was a good restart for me. It gave me an entry into just redefining. So I went on to do really well in my bachelor's. Again, great friends, great teachers. And because of this ecosystem I always had, right, around me, who with whom, like, they also enjoyed doing computers, and I was like, acha yaar, ye achhi cheez hai, right? Let's do it. It became like fun. uh, I think that's how my life and journey has been from early on. I'll pause here if there's anything else that you would want to ask, or steer it into a different direction.
No, I have so many questions, Rohit. I think the way you narrated and spoke about your story, I think there are so many different things to discuss and talk about. I'm curious about how, growing up, there are so many structures that we unconsciously absorb, in terms of the socioeconomic structure, the gender identities, the sexual identities. And there's like this hierarchy depending on where we're brought up, the context we're brought up in, and what is normal, what isn't. And because you've spent so much time as an educator, 18 plus years, and after spending some time in the classroom, I realized that it's so interesting to observe what teachers were like when they were students in the classroom. Some many of the things that they would observe become such an important part of their practice as professionals in the classroom, and trying to create those spaces that they may have noticed were not there or were there in abundance. For me personally, that became like, and that was something I noticed in my professional practice as well. Like, this was something I felt had such a big impact on me, having that one-to-one connection with each child, creating that safe space where all their identities could flourish, not creating a hierarchy in terms of those professions where, you put certain professions on a pedestal. Because a lot of, students growing up in India in the 90s and early 2000s, for us, we had very limited options in terms of professions. It was either engineer, doctor, law as the professions you would choose, and we were, and today if you look at the children growing up, they have so many options and so many different pathways to flourish in. And I think you were also able to navigate all these spaces and find your own circle. But in your university years, Rohit, like, were you what were some of the other things you were also curious about apart from your coursework? Were there other books you were reading, other subjects and disciplines you were interested in at that point?
I think I was very in, I was a language learner in the sense that I enjoy literature, but I'm not a very good new language learner. So
Mhm.
I'll give you a little bit of glimpse of that in my school days, right? I studied in a Hindi medium school till grade 5, and then I was sent to Sainik school, which was a full on English medium school. Like, my history teacher would only speak English. Like, he came from Kerala, and all he spoke was English, right? Not his fault, but just that I didn't have access to anything there, and I really struggled in understanding languages there. But I really embraced of, let's say, reading Premchand. I would read a lot, lots and lots of his books, because I mean, one, it was very accessible. Premchand came from Banaras, which is very close to my hometown, and in UP you have this literature of a certain type of literature that's also shaped my worldview. Like, how am I looking at uh, uh, poverty, how am I looking at politics, how am I looking at human dynamics, right? Premchand books, Sharat Chand books, and then later in my life I started reading Amrita Pritam. So just reading some of these writers, and then reading Kabir or Rahim, uh, their work was very influential in the way I was growing up.
Ah,
uh, I took on to English literature very late in my life,
mm,
and I think thank God for that, because also just embracing the regionalness and the whatever was being experienced in my life.
yeah.
I had a lot of mirrors to my experiences. Uh, in graduation, I think I actually became this person who would not read a lot other than um, what do you say, the coursework, because I became so zoomed in and focused. But I would do a lot of poetry myself. I actually started writing poems in grade 7 or 8 in response to something that was really painful, or that I had experienced. And my first poem was about this uh, a moon which is broken, right? So I used to write some pieces of it, but then it was not very public. I would write it for myself. I'll keep it to myself, kind of thing. But yeah, I think as a child I would read a lot of comics like Nagraj and Chacha Chaudhary and Pinky and Billu and Champak and Nandan. Those were the kind of books that I read as a kid. But I started growing up, I think, while I switched to reading more in Hindi authors, uh, I started reading English literature only like in my masters when I came to Bombay. That was like, otherwise you read Chetan Bhagat ka 5 point someone kind of stuff. But serious literature, I read, I think, Arundhati Roy's God of Small Thing was one of the very impressionable, at a very impressionable time. I read that book and that kind of shook me in so many ways. And I think introduced me to English literature that time.
Yeah, I think that's such a valid point, Rohit. I think that's one of the powers and strengths of being an Indian too, is that we are part of so many spaces. Many of us speak 2 to 3 languages, two at the minimum. Our state language. We use English sometimes in professional situations. Like for my background, I speak Hindi, English, and Tulu, which is a language from Karnataka. So I find that so fascinating that, and when I was in Canada, I realized that English was the primary medium, and knowing another language was almost such a outsider sort of perspective. And I always wondered, like, it's so common in India for people to speak 2 languages at the minimum. And I know friends that speak 4 or 5 languages, depending on, their background. And that gives you so much richness, because the fact that you were able to develop your worldview reading in your mother tongue, reading in another language, and having so many perspectives just gives you so many ways to look at the world. And I feel like your journey sort of encapsulates that, where you grew up reading books from your culture, but also were exposed to other books. In your early professional years, Rohit, you finished your master's degree you did an MCA in Bombay. You moved to a big new city and you were working for Tata Consultancy Services for a significant time. So can you tell me a little bit about that period of your life? And I know it was at that time that you got an opportunity to work in the education sector as well. So what was that period of your life like during your MCA and early professional years?
I think, Abhishek, I came to Bombay as a reaction, or you could say more of a अब नहीं रहना है यहाँ पे kind of scenario. I kind of almost ran away because of 2 3 things. I think uh, I was transitioning out of graduation, and as I had grown up, I had become an adult, right?
Yeah.
I had also started witnessing my father's declining business and the impact of that on the family. And while it was being safeguarded by them, now you're no more a kid, right? You can ask questions, you can see things for what they are. And two, I had become very very acutely aware that I would not be safe as someone who was growing in the way that I was growing with respect to my sexual identity.
Sure.
So I actually was I had a selection in IIT Roorkee. I didn't even tell my father that I and in India IITs are great places, right? I mean, if you get there, you get there. For my masters, I had got an admission, but I didn't tell anyone. I got my admission to a college in Bombay, and I was like, "Yahi pe hua hai," because I wanted to come to Bombay because no one else I knew was here, and I wanted to become. I didn't want to be known by anyone in the city. I wanted to come to a place where I could just start again, right? Start afresh. And that's what Bombay for me was. It was a refuge into figuring it out who I am and who I could be potentially. Uh, College was great. First 2 years again, survived on a super thin budget. So I did not go anywhere in the first 2 years of my college. I was in the hostel. I was given hostels. I was in the hostel in the college campus for the first 2 years. जब पहला बार मेरा internship लगा, I was in a different organization, and with my first stipend, I for the first time went to Hajiri. And the joy of that, like boarding a Mumbai local, going to somewhere on your own money, right? It was really amazing. I think a couple of things before I kind of talk about what were the first few years of my work was. I think I'm really grateful to my dad and my mom for the kind of decisions they they took with me. While as a child, you are always angry with your parents, right?
Yeah.
ये नहीं करने दिया, वो नहीं करने दिया. But I think it's only you connect the dots when you look back. I am grateful that I did not come via the typical teaching route into this work. And that I experienced life in the way I did to then enter into education, because I had a broader perspective of what I wanted to be, and I was able to make decisions for myself, which was a skill I learned on while I was working through life. And especially coming from a joint family जहाँ पे सारे ही decisions आपके लिए कोई ले रहा होता है, right? Or this was something that I needed to do this for myself. So when I joined TCS, I think I was a decent master's graduate from software systems, and then my work was fine. I enjoyed computers. It wasn't something bad. But as a software engineer, you are paid decently. At least you used to be paid decently in this country. In 2006-7 की मैं बात कर रहा हूँ, and you settle down. So you do what you need to do for yourself. You are able to make a living for yourself. घर पे चीजें ठीक हो रही थी as well. So after a point you get bored, right? Because while you are good at it, you still don't know whether this is something you want to kind of spend rest of your life in. And आपके आजू बाजू के जितने भी colleagues हैं ना, they are like, I want to go to on-site in 2 years, I want to do this, and I want to buy a house, I want to buy a car. I would say those things, but they wouldn't mean anything to me. I was like, मतलब जितने भी young people होते हैं ना in the early 20s, एक certain trajectory होती है, right?
Yeah.
Job, घर, गाड़ी, शादी, right? मेरे मन में वो trajectory नहीं थी. And TCS had this really great program, volunteering program called TCS Maitri, where they would invite employees to volunteer in different initiatives like education, environment, or beach cleaning, all sorts of things, right? ऐसे ही एक email आया कि hey, there's this school in Sayan Dharavi area, and we are looking for some volunteers. I was like, and it was on Sundays. I didn't do much on Sundays, right? तो कितना सिनेमा देखेंगे ना आप? तभी तो Netflix वगैरह नहीं था. All you download from those, shitty websites and all of that, right? But after that, how much can you really consume that? पहला 6 महीना आप Monday to Friday काम कर रहे हो, Saturday Sunday you're just hanging. कितना ही मॉल घूम लेंगे, खरीदना तो कुछ होता नहीं है, right? So I went there. I was in the चलो जाते हैं. Me and one of my friends, I think both of us signed up together, and she and I were like, सब कुछ साथ में करना है types. That's when it became a thing for me, and work was fine. I was like working with a US based client, and my shifts were afternoon shifts, and आराम से उठो काम करो, and technology was like not a frightening thing for me. I could code decently, and जहाँ मैं code नहीं कर पाता था दोस्तों को phone करता था, मुझे ये नहीं आ रहा बता दो, right? So asking for help was not a problem. But and then life was going okay. Sunday को मैं school जा रहा हूँ. I think it's only hit me that how much it matters to me when after almost 2 years in being at TCS, my ISU head asked me, hey, do you have your passport? I was like, why do I need a passport? I was like, because you have spent 2 years and you may be scheduled to go on site. And I told him, what if I don't want to go? And he was like, what do you mean? Like, this is a ridiculous question from a young IT engineer, right? Like, you don't want to go on site. What do you even mean by that? Yeah. So I was not able to articulate what do I mean by that. So I kind of came back, said, of course I applied for my passport, etc. But I asked him that जिस स्कूल में मैं यहाँ काम कर रहा हूँ, I think I do want to continue there as well. And he said that, but don't worry about these things. These things are when you grow up and grow old, you can come back and do these things. Abhi career banao. And he was saying it in good faith, right? He was actually caring for me, right? He was thinking that I'm a stupid guy. He was like kind of asking funny questions, right? But I think that was the time, Abhishek, it really hit me that I do not want to leave being in the classrooms. Even if it meant once a week, right? I wasn't even their real teacher. I mean, I was just a sir that would come on Sundays to hang with them. And that was a time, I think, also an opportunity came from Corporate Maitri. It was part of the corporate CSR, the volunteering program that TCS ran, that they were looking for someone. And I I asked them, hey, I don't have a degree or anything, but it's something I do want to do. And it worked out for me in the sense that I left my IT role. I went only in TCS, I moved into my 3 to do CSR work. Uh, they said कि तुम्हारा designations change नहीं होगा, so I didn't have to tell anything at my home, right? तो मैंने घर वालों को कुछ नहीं बताया था. I'd only informed my brother-in-law, who I really adored, and he was like कि तुम क्या कर रहे हो, career suicide ये वो, and I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do and I'm going to do this. पापा मम्मी को नहीं बताया था because मेरा title same था. They continued to call me software engineer, whatever the title was, right? So that's when I transitioned, and I did another 2.5 years I worked with my 3, and that's when I started realizing that while passion and interest is great, we need formal training on education to be in the field of education. And ये समझ आने लगी क्योंकि स्कूल में हम जो कर रहे थे ना वो अच्छा था, ठीक था, लेकिन something was not working, and I was not able to articulate what is not working, right? And two, I also realized that in CSR, companies do all sorts of things, right? They have to. Women empowerment and beach cleanup and education and all sorts of things. And while everything is important, my interest and joy lied in schools and education and classrooms. So that's when I started applying for my second master's from TISS. And I think that was the only college, at least in my awareness, that offered this dual mode तभी के time में, right? I'm talking about 15 years back, where they had this online component and an in-person component. It was primarily for working professionals. So because I couldn't leave my work because I had to pay my rent and take care of my expenses, and I had to pay for my college as well. So I kind of chose this. They kept rejecting me. They rejected me twice. In fact, in the third year when I applied again, the panel was more or less same, and they said, "तुम वापस आ गए?" मैंने बोला, हाँ, क्योंकि यही एक कोर्स है जो मैं कर सकता हूँ. So I need to be here. So yeah, I think that's how kind of my first few years working with teachers were like. Again, met amazing people, made great friends who are now, many of them are my donors to Apni Shala. So that's why I was saying, like, coming via this route also gives you a very different experience of life. And then when you're in the classroom, you are able to kind of see what are different aspirations for children, how are those aspirations have to be nurtured, what are some of the struggles they are experiencing, what are some of the strengths they are bringing and joys they are bringing into the classrooms, right? And how do you kind of, make space for all of them? That I learned while I was volunteering while I was at TCS.
Yeah, and I think it's such a fascinating journey, Rohit, because the chances of having an organization, a CSR initiative within the organization you were working in that gave you that opportunity to work in that space, just the connection of that happening. I think it's so interesting to see how you took up this opportunity and were given sort of the space to be in that space, but yet not leave your role completely. I find that the chances of that happening, really interesting. Like, what if you didn't have that CSR initiative at your organization? You worked in a smaller company that, where the targets were really set for you to work on this job only. And, even you just being open to this other part of your life, because I think early on in your 20s, it's, there are so many decisions you have to make. And very often you are encouraged to move through a particular path. But being flexible to be open to another path and going down that path at that point in your life is not a very easy decision to make, because there are so many expectations on you at that point, in your life. And like I think you're like at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, it's such a wonderful institution and it's not very easy to get admission into the courses over there. Like, was this your space because it's one of the premier social sciences institute in the country? Was this the time you were really, opened up to this beautiful world of the social sciences, Rohit? I know literature was something you were already passionate about, but what about the other fields of social sciences? Is this where that curiosity sort of started for you?
I think it definitely facilitated. And I think I was just lucky, Abhishek, that even when, for example, when I was in that volunteering group, people like Ankur Mitra, who was heading our volunteering initiative, or Nina Skuwala, who was, when I joined thesis math 3. She was heading math 3. There were people who were really passionate about things. And then met some really incredible friends like Jharna or Chetan or Shweta. There were senior TCS employees like Sundaras sir, Nepo sir. They were like really senior folks. But when we would meet on Sundays, you experience life very differently, right? And then the students that I was working with, they kind of pushed and pushed and pushed in so many different ways for me to think about education very differently, think about things very differently. In fact, at this as well, when we were doing sociology of education, that really spoke to me. But it also frustrated me in the sense that for the first time you get exposed to that, okay, you are a cisgendered, hetero looking Hindu Savarna man who is sitting on this host of privileges. And then there's so much of violence that my sisters may have experienced, my mother may have experienced, and I don't know what to do about this.
Correct.
Right? And when you're exposed to so much of systemic violence that is happening to people's lives because of the identities that they come from, and I had an experience of experiencing this violence in a certain aspect of my life, right? As a young gay person growing up, still not out in this country, figuring out how to make sense of this life, right? That took a predominant space in my life. I was so worried about that I never thought about these things. It is only that I started, I mean, even in Sainik school, like I had friends from all over, right? From different types of families, from different kind of caste communities. I did have a lot of interactions with people, but I never, and we lived in communities in the way we lived, right? But also over the years, as this is also the time that I'm talking about 2011, 13, 14, 15, right? That time there's also a certain shift in the socio-cultural political landscape of the country. You are experiencing something is bubbling up, something is changing, right? So in that context, I think I was working with Akanksha Foundation, and I was again right time, right place. I was given a chance to run this program called Social Leadership Program. I think my biggest push of figuring this out for myself came from the group of students I was working with, Akanksha. This program was particularly designed for children who were typically in the bottom quartile of a classroom, right? Or are the dropouts. But then Akanksha believed that all children have potential, so there was a program to just nurture potential of this group of students. We ended up having all sorts of students coming to the program. That was a separate matter. But in that program, many times the kind of questions students ask, the kind of sharing that they will bring forward, I think I didn't have answers to many. For example, I was facilitating a conversation around gender, and a student got up. She was sharing her life story, stuff that happens with young girls, what she was experiencing. घर पे क्या करना पड़ता है, फिर कॉलेज जाना है, फिर जॉब पे जाना है, फिर आके घर पे बर्तन मांजना है. She was narrating her narrative, and then उसके बाद when she got done, and I said, thank you so much, whatever her name was, and I understand this, and I feel your story. And she said in a very gentle way, नहीं भैया आप नहीं समझ सकते, and that's okay. You can't get it. And I know what she meant.
Yeah.
As a man, I can listen to someone's story, but I can't fully get it.
Yeah.
Because at least at that point, I was not even fully listening. I was ready to kind of acknowledge her story, right? So, likewise, when I had to do a session on sexuality, and I had to question that how am I going to talk about this unless I'm myself comfortable and out about this, right? So I had to speak about that in my organization, and also kind of go access therapy to be able to kind of really embrace it. That was also the time my mother passed away, and my mother had a huge influence on my life.
So sorry.
So navigating all of these pieces, right? And there is a politics around that when you're in an educational space. We need to recognize that education is not non-political. It never is. Or however, whatever we want to say. And when I'm saying politically, I'm not meaning that political in terms of political parties, right? What I mean is that there is a certain lens through which education happens. And I didn't know what to do about these examples that are coming out of the classrooms and the systems I'm studying at TESS. And that was the time I happened to read a paper called Peggy McIntosh's the knapsack of white privilege. And that gave me a tool. Then she also has something called knapsack of male privilege. And I happened to kind of start Googling up about Peggy McIntosh, right? Dr. Peggy McIntosh used to run an organization called the National Seed Project. It is based out of Wellesley Center for Women. And I think I just wrote to them, hey, is this something that I can apply for? I'm based out of India. And they responded positively. And kudos to my organization. Akanksha really supported me in the participation. So Vandana, who was my CEO, very encouraging of engaging with the program. I applied for it, went through it, and I think that was one of the very, very crucial experiences that really gave me the tools to navigate this without shame, guilt, blame, resistance, defiance, right? How can I look at all of my experiences together? How can I look at the experiences of systemic marginalization as a young gay person? At the same time, how can I look at the privileges of being a cisgendered male? How can I look at being a Hindu Savarna in a country of ours, right? So how can we look at it together, and how can we look at it from a place of uh, agency and allyship across all identities? And I think that then also shaped the way I was responding to education in my classrooms, like uh, how to navigate conversations around sexual abuse without getting triggered myself. Because as a young child, when you have experienced something and have not processed it yet, how does it show up in the classrooms, right? Or the experiences of poverty, which is not mine. How do I make sense of it? So I did this really, really shitty thing. Now it is shitty, but that time ऐसा लग रहा था कि हाँ मैं बच्चों के लिए अच्छा कर रहा हूँ. I had this really because of my army education background. I'm very particular about people being on time. Even though I was not on time today. But in my class, if a student is late, I was like, really, I would get upset, right? So you don't respect my time, you don't respect your time, ABCD. One of the classrooms, one of the students got late almost by 30 minutes or so, and I asked him to go back home, right? I didn't even ask him, why are you late? I asked him, go back home. And then he didn't even have notebooks. I was like, अच्छा ठीक है अपना बैग रखो, घर जाओ, लेके आओ. That child went back and came back. It's only later through his friends I learned that he didn't have money to come from where he lived, which was like almost 15 kilometers away. He walked, right, to my class. I was like, why would you do that? If I was you, I wouldn't come back, right? But and also realizing that how teachers' beliefs and values shape whatever they call it. Like I would call, I'm teaching you punctuality, I'm teaching you all of that. I would jazz it up, but the fact is, it was purely assertion of my power as a teacher and misuse of it in a way, right? And I think I of course, you go back, you talk to your students, you kind of apologize for stupid things you do, but then I can't undo that. But also recognizing that the space for doing these kind of mistakes, having the community of supervisors and teachers who can hold you accountable to these, right? So I had incredible supervisor and colleagues like Sangeeta or Purvi at Akanksha who were really kind of push me to think through some of these things. Why am I doing what I'm doing? What are the choices I'm making as an educator? What are the programmatic choices we are making for our students? Because ultimately teachers are making those decisions. And how are those decisions shaped by our own beliefs, our own biases? And I think that became the work of my life. In fact, I went on to design a workshop called Life in the Pie. Like, you look at the entire pie chart of your life, and then look at different identities and how different identities kind of shape every moment of every decision making, right? Right now when I'm interacting with you, there is the identities that both of us are responding with. What does it mean in moment by moment basis, and how do we kind of ensure that power is used to facilitate agency, not take away people's agency, right? And that's something that came after thousands of mistakes, and I'm just grateful for my students at SLP that they still kind of have stayed in touch with me, right? It is only that they are very, very generous people who have allowed me to be in their life despite all the errors I did as an educator in the first few years of my teaching. But I think that is what, going back to your question, Abhishek, the cumulative experiences of being at TIS, being at National Seed Project, being at Akanksha, All of this together kind of shaped and formed my understanding of what education is and what it is not. For example, I don't believe that education is this one pill that will solve all the problems of the world. Right? I don't believe that, and I think that is actually very problematic if we start assuming that, because education is not going to solve for poverty. Education can solve for poverty of some people who might move out of the cycle, or others will get into. So poverty is a system by itself. We have to look at class and poverty from a very different lens. Sure, education intersects with it, but it is not going to solve for it. I think also, mm, I became very angry and very activisty about anyone who would say things like that, right? Because my experiences of my students were very different. What they were experiencing in their schools and colleges were also reminiscences of what I had experienced 20 years back. And it was not okay कि 20 साल में कुछ बदला ही नहीं है, right? They were experiencing bullying and shame because of the kind of language they spoke, the way they smell, the way they kind of, their body odor is, the way they kind of, wrote or not wrote in their exams, the kind of books they carry or not carry. And I was like, this is ridiculous, right? That we are still stuck in a world that is caring for things of this nature. And that young people have to experience so much of exclusion and violence in the name of systems and education. So I think, there's just being able to be in conversation with students and not just in the classroom. Like we would hang outside, like, जब class खत्म हो जाती थी हम बैठ के चाय पीते थे, students और हम, मैं और संगीता, and the kind of conversations that will come from there, the reflections and debriefs that will happen at the chai ka tapri, right? And because my students were also older students, right? They were junior college students, so I could hang with them in that way. So I think, just some of these together did contribute to what I started understanding about education, more or less.
Very, very powerful, Rohit. And I got a chance to briefly be part of that, setup, and it was like 10 years ago. I remember I was also very young in another phase of my life, and I don't remember. I know I was doing a small session, and I think even after the session, speaking to you, I realized some of the biases I was carrying myself. Where you assume that certain things and you want to share it with other people, but you don't realize that you have so many flaws and biases in how you are communicating that. And I think that was something you pointed out to me that really shaped my thinking, in a significant way there. And I think there is so much richness in accepting that there are intersectionality of identities where you may have a position of privilege in one identity, but you are marginalized in the other, and how you are able to converse with these different identities and also relate to other people and how they are making sense of that. I really like the analogy of that life in the pie, because you realize that on a day-to-day basis we are engaging and conversing with these identities, not only with ourselves but in our workplaces, in our homes, in society in general. And how do we create a safe space for all of these identities to flourish? And I know after Akanksha, you were at the American School of Bombay, which is one of the premier K-12 IB schools in the system, uh, before you started, Apni Shala. So what were some things you observed in, an institution like that, and that you thought, changed your perspective as an educator as well?
I think I actually, again, went to ASB as an experiment, right? I was kind of wrapping up my work at Akanksha, and I was like, I wanted to kind of take a pause. In fact, I wanted to go for my PhD. But I was like, अच्छा ठीक है, ये मौका आया है, देख लेते हैं. I have worked with students from certain context for last couple of years, and I was like, okay, let's see what this world looks like, right? And I entered with a lot of apprehension in the sense that I don't know whether I will sustain there, right? And why I'm saying that is because it was a very, very different world for me.
Sure.
I remember my interview with Fiona, who was my supervisor as well for all 4 years when I was there. She is an incredible person. I think the first thing I asked is, hey, I identify as a gay person. Is it okay if I'm out about that? And she's like, why will it not be okay? And I think that's the kind of support I had at ASB, and then again, the kind of people that you meet, the friends that you make when you are in any place. Uh, but I think at American School of Bombay, something that I was not hoping and learned while working with students and teachers there is that there are certain things that are common across.
Yeah.
In young people's life, all sorts of young people from whatever background experience neglect of parents, and that has an impact on being of students, right? Mental health, now that we call it what it is, despite like having some of the greatest counselors in that school, many students would not go to the counselors, right? And not just because, and ASB had a very encouraging culture, right? We spoke about it very, very openly, but also that what are the social influences, who else is influencing our decision of what to access, what not to access, right? I used to run this event called Expressions, which was, I was teaching a program called Global Leadership at American School of Bombay, and at the end of it, we would talk about some of these experiences. And one thing that I kept asking my students at ASB was, do not think of, अच्छा हम सर्विस करने जा रहे हैं तो हम किसी और के लिए कुछ करने वाले हैं, right? Let's talk about ourselves. And in one of the conversations, so a child was doing a project on child labor, and I was like, okay, what do you want to do in this project? And they said that we want to go and interview children who are involved in child labor. I was like, okay, why so? Because there are already so much of content available online.
Yeah.
If you go to YouTube, you will find it. But what do you want to interview, right? Why do you think child labor exists?
Yeah.
And slowly, they started kind of recognizing that how do we locate the problem where the problem is versus only talking about the symptom. A child responding to a child labor is only a symptom.
Yeah.
But if there are governments and institutions failing to make right kind of systems where you have vendors who do not involve child labor, like, and I asked, like, hey, what would it look like if you go back to your and their parents ran businesses? And I was like, why did you go and interview your parents and check whether they are working with any vendor who is involving child labor, and why do they not have a policy against it, or do they have one, and what does it look like, right? So the project shifted, right? We started investigating our own lives of how am I contributing to a problem that I think it is out there, right? Likewise for climate change, likewise for gender, right? So one of the young girls wanted to get into, in fact, I'm still in connection with that girl, and her family has become one of our biggest supporters of Apnishala's work. She wanted to interview daughters of sex workers to understand what a gender look like. And I asked, what is your gender experience? Can you first talk about that? And she's like, no, I'm everything is fine, ABCD, and took multiple conversations to recognize that as a young female person, she has never unpacked her own experience of gender, right? So looking at one, young people are really, really excited to learn if you facilitate it in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah.
And two, a lot of these socio-economic pieces do impact the way education gets designed for people. Right. Akanksha had this incredible IB program, which particularly for primary years, which so much of love and care and social emotional well-being was centered. And I was like, sorry, this is something which should happen for all children.
Yeah.
Right? That care and joy and love cannot be commodified, and it can't be only accessible at a certain cost for children.
Yeah.
And in India, education is a constitutional right.
Yeah.
For all children of at least the primary education is, right?
Yeah.
So how would it look like if we start saying that every child has a constitutional right of a care and love based education?
Wow. Right?
That shifts the conversation, and not that it is very costly, right? To love someone is not very costly. It is super. It's very affordable.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of my biggest takeaways, that young people across the spectrum are young people. They are navigating their lives in the ways that they are. And schools have a very, very strong role to either perpetuate the systems that young people are currently living in, or alter the discourse, right? It's the school's responsibility and opportunity. I also realize that now that I run schools and build systems, I realize it's not easy.
Yeah.
right? If anyone even wants to do it, there are 1,000 hurdles.
Yeah.
The question is that what's the purpose of our life? And it's a very philosophical question,
Yeah.
but that kind of guides everything else. Like, what are we here for?
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that shaped how I started looking at education in a more wholesome, more overall fashion,
Yeah.
and not only looking at what is happening for a certain kinds of communities, but also uh, how education needs differentiation and what are some of the good practices across the spectrum
Mm.
that can be borrowed here and there. In fact, a lot of work that I did at American School of Bombay was coming from Akanksha, right?
Right. Yeah.
In fact, in ASB, we had this really cool drama teacher called Rob. Rob and I kind of partnered in my last 2 years of ASB to put together a program called Staging Changes, right? And Staging Changes was a 2-month educational initiative. It was the centering around theater, but then we had around 20 students from American School of Bombay and same number of students from Akanksha Foundation. Uh, and they would stay together for the entire 2 months. So Akanksha students would go into different classrooms. They would be learning at ASB as if they were the students of ASB, right?
Mm.
And then towards the end of 2 months, they will be putting together a theater production. And I realized that there was a possibility, right? You could start breaking these uh, stupid barriers that are existing between communities and students. And of course, not that everything was hunky dory, right? I mean, students had their reservations. You needed some process for them to open up, start sharing. It takes time,
Yeah.
but uh, we had the opportunity, we had the resources. Why not do it, right? And I think just very very grateful to the kind of ecosystem American School of Bombay offered, that we could do all of these initiatives. We could kind of take chances. We can make sense of some of these things. I remember in one of our poetry closing sessions that I used to do, I started calling parents like I would do at Akanksha, right? Parents were always part of every celebration, and yahan pe we made it mandatory that someone from your primary guardian has to come, because many of these parents would be like traveling across the globe, right? One of the great students in grade 9, in a global leadership course, wrote a poem about what it meant for her when her nanny died in Singapore. Her mom was sitting in the audience. This girl started forming the poem and then tears dropped down. And the mother was sobbing and the daughter was sobbing. And towards the end of the perform, after the event, the mother came and told me that, Mr. Kumar, I never knew that my daughter felt so strongly about, she named the nanny. And I was like, yeah, because ultimately we are all humans, right? We are kind of relating at people at different levels, and all of these titles and roles and jobs. Like for a young girl, the closest person was that nanny who was mostly available, right? So she related with her in a certain way and never had a chance to mourn because they had moved here when she had died, right? So there's so much of grief that we don't let our students process. There's so much of joy we don't let people process in the way that are healthy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was my. I mean, Amrita had already started Apni Shala 2013-14. Amrita, Shweta, and Nukiti, they started Apni Shala. But we stayed in touch. I knew Amrita from Akanksha and TIS because both of us were in the same batch at TIS. And we continued to stay talking about some of these aspects of education that we didn't know what to call it. Life skills hai, value education hai, social emotional learning hai, kya hai. But we kept talking about it, and around 2016-17, it became more clear that that's something we want to do together. Sangeeta also joined in, and we kind of started understanding that what would it look like if psychosocial well-being is at the core of everything that a school does. And that's when I started moving out of American School of Bombay and started working with Apni Shala a little bit more.
Wow. Today morning I was actually reading the reports that Apni Shala puts out, and thank you so much for putting out that information there, Rohit. And I also feel like you've created so many resources, not just for your school, but also for other schools that want to engage with social emotional learning. And I feel like that can be an entire 1 hour conversation in itself. But in your report you mentioned in 2022-2023 that there were over 45 plus people. The Coach Community School was awarded the world's best school for community collaborations. I loved the diversity and evaluation framework that you were able to create that other institutions could use. but also the fact that you are not only implementing that for your community school, but you also worked with over 26 different MCGM schools and NGOs. And I'm sure those numbers are much more now. But, Rohit, I know you've put out so much information about Apni Shala, and, you've been in, working as an organization for so many years. In the report, it was 6+ years. I'm sure it's a lot more. So can you just tell me about your journey and vision with Apni Shala? And, I will preface this for the listeners that it's very hard to do this in a short amount of time. I highly recommend going through the Apni Shala website to understand their, years of work and journey. And I think this conversation was really about Rohit's journey. I feel like Apni Shala is a whole giant story in itself. And so, but I'd love to know from your words as the CEO of Apni Shala, what were you trying to do when you started off, and where are you right now?
I kind of laugh about it now.
Yeah,
Not at the question, but just thinking about this. We actually, Abhishek, started off as building libraries.
really? Okay.
Yeah. So Amrita, Shweta, and Nukriti wanted to do this really cool libraries across schools where we can have like really lovely picture books, because picture books are incredible resources to spark off amazing conversation, right?
Yeah.
There are two things that were clear then, which is still true today. So after 12 years of Apni Shala, we started in 2013 officially, got registered in 2013, but the work started in 2011, 12. Uh, the idea was that how can you use picture books, how can you use theater, how can you use play, art and music and singing, or as a medium to create spaces for young people where they can express and be who they want to be on a day-to-day basis. And because life skills was something that was understood and known, we would say building life skills through libraries, right? Over the course of the years, right, we were also figuring it out. What क्या है ये, क्यों कर रहे हैं, कैसे कर रहे हैं, और क्यों ही करना है, right? Is there something even required in this world? But एक चीज clear थी, we wanted to work with public schools because we believe that we didn't want to become like a parallel institution, and two, public schools are the only institution that can implement the constitutional right of the child, right? So we wanted to work with them to ensure that children in public schools who are receiving free and compulsory education are receiving a good quality free and compulsory education. So that has remained true even till today and in the future, because our primary work is with Mumbai Municipal Corporation. Now we are also working with Mira Bhayandar Municipal Corporation. So working with local government bodies became a very, very important vehicle. We didn't want to work with state because जितनी बड़ी बॉडीज का काम करते हो उतना आपका काम मैक्रो हो जाता है, which has its own value, but Apni Shala is a very ground organization. We like want to do things, see it for what it is, then take it to the macro. So we kind of want to stay on the ground, and municipal corporations became our primary intervention sites, right? Around 15, 16, Abhishek, things started becoming more clearer that psychosocial development is the area we want to work in. And by then, we also kind of started looking at public mental health as a framework, right? That education has to be done at the intersection of mental health and education, and not just looking at it from a skilling point of view, but also from a systems point of view. And by 16, 17, the language evolved for us. We started saying that we want to provide opportunities for students for psychosocial development where they can learn and practice certain skills. And at the same time, they're experiencing an ecosystem which is caring, inclusive, and compassionate. We have to create both. And which meant that at some point we also realized we are the system, right? हम सिस्टम की बात करते तो हम बोलते अच्छा वो सिस्टम उसको फिक्स होना है, but Apni Shala had to fix itself, right? What kind of system are we, our students are experiencing, what kind of system? When we are building schools, what are the policies, practices, teacher training, how are teachers experiencing the system, right? All of this became a site for review, and that's when I think I joined Apni Shala in 2017, more formally started volunteering with them in 15, but joined part-time in 17, then joined full-time in 19 in this role of being a CEO. And at Apni Shala, we have a collaborative leadership. So being a CEO doesn't really mean anything. We have co-directorship where we are kind of in peer supervision, accountable to the organization collectively. And since then, I think in 18, 19, we started thinking about what should we define our work as, and where are we moving forward. So in fact, our number of schools have gone down, Abhishek. Now we are not working with 26 schools. We are only working with around 14-15 schools a year. Hopefully that number will grow, but the growth will be slower, because in the last strategic planning, when we started rethinking, uh, we started understanding this work requires certain kind of time, certain kind of pacing. We can't rush through this. ये 2 साल के फेलोशिप में, 1 साल के इंटरवेंशन में, 6 महीने के प्रोजेक्ट में नहीं हो सकता. It requires sustainable long-term psychosocial development, which starts from kindergarten, goes all the way to grade 10. At least 12 years of sustained work in any school. हाँ, उसमें phases आते हैं. हमारा रोल कम होने लगता है across the schools. So when we start, we for example, in the phase 1 of the schools, we work with them, with students and teachers and principals. In phase 4 or phase 3, we may want to primarily focus on working with teachers and principals in the climate of the school, because now teachers are able to do these things with their students. We are not required there, right? So that is what we have charted our journey as. We are also building a lab school called Coach. Basically, this is a school which is being done in partnership with Mumbai Municipal Corporation, but that's a school that Apni Shala kind of is building to make sense of what does an SEL aligned well-being focused school looks like, feels like. What are the policies, practices, systems? What is cost per child? What is a genuine cost per child? Because many times these conversations are reduced to say that, अच्छा ये तो बड़ा ही expensive affair है. Expensive for whom? Compared to what? Right? Many times donors would say that this is not scalable because it is very resource intensive. Resource intensive compared to what? We have to start asking a different kind of question, because education for children of the poor has been seen as a low cost initiative. But that cannot remain as is, right? Because that is the problem. Because we believe that कुछ बच्चों को 20 लाख की एजुकेशन चाहिए और कुछ बच्चों को 20,000 की एजुकेशन चाहिए. एंड फिर हम बोलेंगे कि मेरिट है, आप अप्लाई करो. आप कैसे होगा ना, ये तो अनफेयर है अगर स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट ही सो प्रॉब्लमेटिक है. सो हाउ डू वी इंश्योर दैट देयर इज इक्विटी इन एजुकेशन? सो आई थिंक that's something we have to kind of re-ask ourselves, and that's where Apni Shala is kind of focusing its work in years to come. That one, we want to do really deep solid work on the ground in the schools that we are operating in, working with teachers and parents and communities and students, and at the same time start working with institutions where we can focus more on policy implementation. We don't want to change. New education policy is decent, right? It talks about some of the really good child-centric pieces, but budget allocation ही नहीं है उसके लिए. 2020 में न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी आई, देयर इज नो क्लियर फाइनेंशियल पाथवे फॉर दैट. कि अच्छा आप बोल रहे हो कि एक student teacher ratio should be 1:25 in marginalized communities. What is the pathway for that? For teacher recruitment, teacher training, ensuring that there are special educators in the school. There's no pathway for that, right? So working with the bodies, and again, I understand it's complex. I understand it takes its own time. But how do we move some of these pieces in the schools becomes critical. And I think when we are speaking about mental health or well-being focused schools, we have to start looking at some of these aspects as well, right? For simple things, is where is toilet? Is there a toilet in the school? Is it a clean toilet? Is it a safe toilet, right? We have to ask these questions because it has an impact on how a young girl or a boy experience well-being on a day-to-day basis in the school setting, right? So these things have also become very, very critical for us to start identifying क्या चीज में move हो सकती है, क्या नहीं move हो सकती. What can Apni Shala influence in, what can Apni Shala not influence in. So working at on the ground, but also using the insight from the ground to create awareness, build partnerships. Our work is very, very partnership focused. We believe that Apni Shala कुछ बहुत ज़्यादा नया नहीं कर रहा है. There are stuff that people have done. How can we bring communities together, bring different non-profits together? How can we be part of other people's efforts and initiatives? सब कुछ हमें करने की जरूरत नहीं है. For example, there are people who come to us कि अच्छा कर्नाटक में SEL करना है. Like कर्नाटक में there are great organizations here. Why don't we connect you to them, right? So can we build a more larger ecosystem beyond? Apni Shala is the vehicle for us to do what we are doing, but it's more about sectoral engagement. How can we engage with the larger education sector, for-profit, non-profit, private, international, local schools? How can we all start coming together to have a conversation about two things in particular? One, is the child at the center of every decision we are making? And if not, that decision is not okay. And two, how do we look at teachers' identity as educators, as facilitators of this system in a new way? We can keep talking about why Norway and Sweden and countries are doing great, but we are not talking enough about what's happening to our teachers. What is happening to, and I'm not only talking about salary, Abhishek. Salary is one piece of it. Of course, our teachers have to be paid better, uh, but there is a really uh, uh, dehumanization of the identity of this role in the country. Right? We have dehumanized it, uh, taken away the agency from this role. We need to kind of bring it back. Like, can a teacher really make decisions about their classrooms? Do they have enough planning time? Have we considered what are their lives? What are their challenges? Are we thinking about how much administrative duties are being given to teachers? Are we seeing them as people who are implementers or people who are creative thinkers? Right? And all of that, can same person can do different things, and we have experienced it. Like, we work with government schools, right? Incredible teachers. When you sit with them and talk to them with respect and dignity, they are able to think about their students. Why not, right? They are qualified teachers. So how do we ensure that people have enough respect and dignity in the profession that they're coming into, and nurture it continuously? I think these two things are the main insights from this work that is coming up, and we are kind of very actively talking about this, that how can we talk about it more and more and more in all sorts of spaces, not just low income schools, but also high income schools, private schools, because same challenges exist in there. The only difference is, उन बच्चों के पास ना घर में किताबें होती हैं, ट्यूटर्स होते हैं और पढ़ाई हो जाती है. वहां पे भी स्कूलों में वही सिमिलर चैलेंज है, बट उसको सॉल्व फॉर कैसे करना है उसको साथ में मिलकर सोचना.
Yeah, and like that's such an important point you put up, Rohit. Rohit, I'm so sorry about the time. Is it okay if we just go 5 minutes more, Rohit? And I don't want to, because I know it's the middle of your day too. But like, I mean, I just want to build on like so many of the points that you said, that so the same problems exist whether it is a private school that's well funded, or a public school that's well funded. I think it's very easy to assume that certain problems exist in only certain spaces, but I feel like it is present across the ecosystem. And I love what you said about thinking about that identity of the teacher. I feel like we underappreciate the fact that in many of our schools the student teacher ratio is much higher than 1 to 20. It's 1 to 40, 1 to 60. And in those situations, it's so commendable what teachers are able to do with the resources and the experience that they have. And I think those stories are real stories of success. And I feel like your point about understanding macro policy level like interventions is also very important. And I see your work as such an important nodal point where through the work you are doing with Coach and Apnishala, I feel like as you are able to implement it at a systemic level in your institution, it becomes a sort of guiding light to how we can slowly take this across larger structures and larger systems. Again, it's such a complex problem, education. There are so many stakeholders, and in our country with over 1 billion people and so many students, it is such a massive problem. And I don't think it's possible for one organization or one individual or even one minister or one teacher to really do that. This is something we have to do over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think it's policy and practice and theory that has to come together in a way. But for the listeners tuning in, I would highly recommend engaging with Rohit and Apnishala through their website. They have a lot of data and information to help understand their work better. I really enjoyed reading their reports and watching their videos. But Rohit, for the last question, uh, I just wanted to ask you if you could recommend one resource. It could be a book, film, podcast that somehow shaped your thinking, and um, that you would like to share with the listeners of this podcast. That would be a great way to end this particular episode.
Oh.
That's a very loaded question. There's so many resources you must have it, but something that you go back to periodically again and again and gives you new insights every time you go back to it.
I I think there is a I won't say a particular resource, but the body of work that has happened through narrative practices. Narrative practice is a postmodern therapy practice, and much of our work is informed by that, Abhishek. Um, I think if you just Google up narrative therapy, narrative practices, a lot of research comes up. Narrative practices India does a lot of work around just putting out a great, incredible resource. Uh, I also think there is a book that is my kind of a Bible, Quran, Gita, whatever you want to call it, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. That book has shaped, or rather questioned, more than shaping. I think it has questioned my own existence as a person and as an educator. I think at any educator at some point in their life must read it. I keep going back to the book, sometimes different chapters, different places. I think that book has influenced the way I think about education in so many ways. Um, I also think there's a lot of useful resource on Apnishala's blog site, which is more if you're looking for practice informed resource. Much of our articles are written by the teachers in the classroom, the helper didis, the admin person. So it's like very, very ground resource, like, how to do things and reflections of practitioners. I think that might be a useful resource to go back to as well.
Perfect. And on that note, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories. To the listeners tuning in, stay tuned for more such stories of amazing young people doing things in their space to make this world a better place. And until next time, keep learning. Thank you,
Thank
Rohit.
you,
Thank you
Abhishek.
so much.